All right, Jen, you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, like I said, good morning. My name is Tracy. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the Prevention Program Manager with the WCA.
And hi, I am Janelle Johnson. I am a licensed master social worker and a clinician here at the WCA, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. So just to get started with what we're hoping to cover in this morning's presentation on social norms is first to just understand the connection between certain social norms and the violence, victimization, and perpetration that they may be related to. Also, we're hoping to increase just general knowledge of the limitations of developing healthy relationships within our very rigid gender binary. And then finally, to develop skills and tools to foster inclusive norms and how to create a safer school climate overall.
All right, so for those of you who may not be familiar with the WCA, we are a local nonprofit organization, and our mission is to provide safety, healing, and freedom from domestic abuse and sexual assault. We do this in a bunch of different ways by providing services to those in the community who've been impacted by these things. For example, 24-hour hotlines, safe shelter, case management, therapy, support groups, kind of a whole variety of services that someone might need who is trying to escape or leave a violent situation, or maybe they've experienced violence in the past and need kind of help healing from that. So that's the mission. That's kind of what we do every day. But our larger vision as an organization, and why I think it's really important that we're in spaces like this and talking to folks in the community, is because our vision, so kind of what we're working towards, is a community where individuals thrive in safe and healthy relationships. And so really that's where we're going to be kind of moving into for the conversation today and talking about social norms and how those can impact our community in terms of safety and relationships.
So just to set the stage a little bit of what we know and why we're talking about what we're talking about today, why this is important, a few general statistics to get us started. So nationally, we know that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner. We also know that the most common age when intimate partner violence is first experienced is age 18 to 24, and that's 43% of all people will experience this first intimate partner violence between those ages. To bring it a little more locally, we know that 20.8% of Idaho female students versus 15.6% for the US overall were forced to engage in unwanted sexual acts. And then to hone in even more locally, a recent survey of our WCA shelter residents, so that's everyone who lives in our safe shelter, reported that 80% experienced abuse for the first time before the age of 18. So just to highlight how young we know these first experiences of violence are happening for most people.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't also acknowledge that the rates of sexual, domestic, and dating violence are higher amongst marginalized populations. So people with disability are 3 times as likely to be sexually assaulted as their peers without disability. Lesbian, gay, bisexual people experience sexual violence at similar or higher rates. And studies suggest that around half of transgender people and bisexual women will experience sexual violence at some point in their lives. Studies also suggest that Black and Indigenous women of color experience rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner at 30 to 50% higher rates than the general population. And what I'd like to say too about this is that these statistics are really limited. There isn't actually a lot of data out there, particularly about marginalized populations. And so in actuality, rates are probably even higher than what we are seeing in the limited data that we have access to. So again, just acknowledging that those most marginalized in our community are also most impacted by violence.
Okay, so now to give us a definition of abuse, just so as we're going forward today, we have some shared common language. So we are using the definition that abuse is a pattern of actions that are used to gain and maintain power and control over another person. And for this, we mean in all types of relationships. So of course, we certainly do a lot of work on domestic abuse, which would be certain types of relationships, but we're here talking about romantic partners, between friends, within families, within, you know, just any relationship where someone is using power and control to maintain and gain that power over another person. So any type of power imbalance in a relationship that's intentional is a form of abuse. And we're going to be talking about that within all types of relationships moving forward today.
So this is where we really start kind of expanding our lens. So again, statistics and everything are great to kind of get us on the same page, but this is really where we're going to dive into today's content, because social norms are key to understanding violence and why violence happens within relationships and within our community. Because sexual assault, stalking, domestic violence, dating violence, they don't just happen. There's a lot of multi-level factors that influence and shape behavior. And it's more than just individual characteristics. So we really have to be intentionally trying to address all of the levels of factors that influence violence, and not just focusing on those individual characteristics if we really want to create change, because violence ultimately is a symptom of a larger problem in our community and in our society as a whole. So this is a model that we use in our work to do violence prevention. It's called the social ecological model. This is a pretty well-known public health model, but it does a great job of kind of expanding, again, beyond those individual characteristics that oftentimes we think about as like, well, violence is just one person's choice. That's technically true. Someone can make a decision or a choice to commit violence or perpetrate violence against somebody else. But there are a lot of other factors beyond just those individual characteristics that make it possible for violence to happen. So again, we do understand we need to pull in that individual piece. So that would be somebody's biological, predetermined kind of biology, their personal history. We do know that, you know, being impacted by violence or experiencing violence makes it more likely that somebody will perpetrate or be victimized by violence again later in life. We do not know that that's true. But we also have to expand to include relationship level characteristics or factors. So somebody's friend group, their peers, their family, all of those relationships can impact, again, somebody's ability to perpetrate violence against another person, or it might impact their experiences of violence. When we expand even further into the community level, we're looking at things like the school environment, neighborhoods. Again, we know that in neighborhoods where there's other types of violence happening, maybe that's gang violence or high rates of crime, things like that, there's a higher likelihood that rates of domestic violence and sexual violence will increase as well. And then kind of on the largest level, we're looking at these social and cultural norms, and that's really where we're going to hone in on today. And then ultimately the policies that either enforce those norms or support those norms or go against those norms. We won't get as into that today, but really going to be looking at that societal and cultural norms piece. So we would like you to use the chat. And when you hear the term social norms, what does that make you think of? Or can you think of examples of social norms that, again, kind of pop up in our everyday lives? But what do you think of when you think social norms? And Jen, I cannot see the chat, so if you could read them out, that would be super helpful.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking at it. Okay, things that general society believe is socially acceptable or normal, socially acceptable and tolerated behavior. Okay, we're getting to examples. How we greet one another. That is certainly a social norm. Ethics that model our life structure. Unwritten rules. Absolutely. Any specific examples, kind of like the greeting one another? Anything that you think of as an example? Saying thank you. Definitely. Apologizing, that's certainly become a social norm. Shaking hands when you meet someone new. Yes, these are great examples. Agreed upon by most with this topic, there's an unhealthy unwritten rule of not speaking about things like abuse after. Ooh, we're definitely going to talk about that. It's a great one. Length of speaking before it's the other person's turn. Absolutely. Okay, these are great ones. Personal space, yes. So let's go ahead and dive into social norms a little more. So these are all really great examples. Everyone, has the ones that kind of come to mind for them first, but I'm sure as people write these, we all see how common they are. And these are so common, we can think of them so quickly because as a society, we all really tend to prefer to conform to these norms. We are, of course, social creatures by nature. We want to belong, not be seen as out of the pack. And so because of this, at a very young age, we learn that in order to do that, you need to conform to these norms to stay a part of social groups. And therefore, we then really expect others to also conform. And thus, nonconformity results in consequences. So some of these will be formal, like getting a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt, right? That's a very formal consequence for not following a norm. But most of them, what we're going to be talking about today, are more informal consequences that can, in many ways, be just as powerful. So, for example, if you don't wash your hands in a public bathroom, especially nowadays, right? You're not going to get a ticket. You're not breaking the law or some form of policy, but you might get a lot of dirty looks from other people in there. Maybe people will start whispering and talking about you. Maybe even, friend groups will point or something. And so that's what we're talking about as these informal consequences. But because we are social beings by nature, those informal consequences are really, really key and important. And so that's why norms are one of the most powerful societal and community influences in how we shape behavior and how we learn to exist in this world and how we know how to act. And so these seemingly, unimportant informal consequences are actually really, really important in how we learn how to exist in this world.
Right. Thanks, Jen. So yeah, we're surrounded by these norms and we really internalize them as we grow up and they become just a part of our being. So today, again, there's lots of social norms out there, but we know that there are 4 main ones that we want to highlight today in terms of norms that specifically impact gender-based violence or abuse. So we're looking at these norms that particularly promote violent or toxic environments while also inhibiting action. And that was brought up actually in the chat, right? So they kind of promote this culture of toxicity while also like deterring any sort of interference or assistance in those cases. And we're going to look at specifically how this impacts the forms of violence, especially that we end up seeing around the WCA and interpersonal violence. So those 4 norms that we're going to dive into here are rigid gender roles, particularly within the traditional binary. Power and control. Again, when we look at the definition of abuse, it literally is an imbalance of power and control, and our society is set up in a way where that's the norm. So when we think about it in terms of interpersonal violence, it makes a lot of sense of why we're seeing that a lot. Violence in general, and then privacy and silence. Again, that idea of not wanting or not being able to talk about what's going on.
Okay, so before we really dive into specifics on gender roles, I just want to establish a few important points on rigid gender roles in general. So first of all, we are already, really normalizing the gender binary when we are assuming we know someone's gender identity, right? So the first thing I want to caution is just ever making an assumption about this and thinking about how we can in turn be normalizing things to ask someone's gender identity, to not be normalizing that we just know it. Second, another dangerous social norm is the pervasiveness of heteronormativity. So I also just want to draw some attention to how often we hear adults in particular, ask a boy if he has a girlfriend or what girls he's interested in, and vice versa, right? And again, just the major assumptions we're making when we're normalizing that kind of conversation with youth. And then finally, before we dive into specifics, I want to draw attention to the assumptions that we tend to make on how we expect flirting to show up based on gender. So this is where the classic examples come in about boys teasing girls just because they like them, or normalizing it perhaps for a boy to be more quote unquote aggressively flirting with girls. And the reason that I want to highlight that is because a 2011 report from the American Association of University Women found that in just 1 year, 56% of high school girls and 40% of high school boys experienced sexual harassment in school. And so I think that so often kids flirting can pretty quickly cross the line to actually being more harassing. And so just really drawing attention to questioning what assumptions we may make about what that should look like, especially when we have that statistic in mind of how quickly that can really cross that line. So with all of those kind of considerations in mind, we are going to now dive into a little more specifics about gender roles. So using the chat again, go ahead and type in what are some assumptions that we may make about how boys should act and behave in school? And I want to say that this, of course, doesn't have to be that you yourself make these assumptions. Many of you probably don't, but just as a society, thinking about social norms, what tends to be the ones that are made about how boys should act and behave in school? Boys don't cry. Absolutely. But boys should be tough. What else? I'm not interested in soft subjects. Absolutely. Boys play with trucks and cars. Boys should not express their feelings. Oh, we're flying now. Strong and athletic. Athletic again. Roughhousing is natural play. Overt leaders in sports. Not showing emotions. Man of the house if there's not a dad around. Good at math and science. Yes, these are all spot on. Yeah, so many of these were said, and isn't it interesting how quickly these all come to mind, right? And how aware we all are of them around how boys should dress, certainly. So the first thing, right, boys will be boys. And so what does that even really mean? It's often all of these things we're talking about. So we certainly make a lot of assumptions around what sports are acceptable or that boys should be participating in. And those are often ones that are already normalizing more violence, right? So things like football, wrestling, and then even other sports of just how we expect boys to show up and be more aggressive in, right? Those are all ways that we're just normalizing that boys are going to be more violent and that it's okay and acceptable. So things like people said roughhousing, right? All of those things that we are just beginning to say, like, boys are allowed and should be a little more violent, a little more aggressive. No discussion of emotions and feelings. People said things like boys don't cry, boys should be tough. Thus, we're not really giving boys all the space to then express feelings and emotions that of course we know that they're having. And then finally, around school subjects. So a couple of people said this, we're just generally assuming boys are interested in math and science, they're good at those. I think someone said the soft subjects, we're then not really giving them the space to be interested in, to express themselves in those other types of subjects at all. So let's now take a look at what are some of the assumptions we make. Again, not that you yourself perpetuate these, but as a society, what are some of the norms we say about how girls should act and behave in school? They should be nice. Yes, absolutely. Quiet, more mature, and more academic. They should always smile, be very submissive, make everyone happy, feminine, quiet and polite, cheerleaders, that they should follow the rules. Absolutely. They should be the helpers, yes. These are great. So we're kind of already seeing let the boys lead. Not cause trouble. Clothes that show off their body, good penmanship. You should just kind of go unnoticed, be virtuous. The penmanship one always comes up. It's interesting. Okay, absolutely. They should be able to multitask. Yeah. So generally, these are all around, the submissive, the niceness that girls should just kind of blend in the background, not cause any trouble, and help everyone else. It's a lot to put on girls, right? So, but they're generally just more. We assume they're more sensitive, and that shows up in a couple ways. That we expect them to be more overtly sensitive. Maybe we think girls cry more easily, that they're too sensitive. But we also then expect that sensitivity to show up to allow them to be really responsible and the caretakers of everyone else. And that might also include being the caretakers of other boys and boys' feelings, that they are just managing all of that and should just be taking care of all of that in the background. A couple of people said submissive, right? Quiet. Whereas conversely for boys, we said roughhousing and maybe kind of the troublemakers. We very much don't expect that from girls and expect them to be kind of managing all of that, making sure that things are going okay. Someone just said moody, so that certainly goes around with the sensitive thing, right? And then we also expect them to be generally more interested in the arts and social sciences, and therefore not expecting them to be good at math and science or to really excel in those subject areas. And then I also just want to note that on both sides, people said boys are the more natural leaders, and then by virtue of that, girls should be just allowing boys to step into that leadership role and being just, again, kind of submissive and quiet in the background. These are all great examples. Thank you, everyone. You're right on top of these, which just shows us how pervasive these gender norms are, of how quickly we're able to come up with them.
All right, so switching now into the norm around power and control. What are some ways that we can see power and control show up maybe in the classroom or the school environment? Again, just thinking about kind of how that shows up. And Jen, I'm going to ask you to read them out again because I still can't see the chat.
Perfect. Okay, so we have dress code and our discipline enforcement. Boys speak up first, usually in group discussions.
Absolutely. The dress code one is very interesting, and I could talk all day about that. But again, a lot of these dress codes end up really regulating or controlling what female identified students end up wearing to protect the male students from being distracted, right? Oh, I could go on forever about that. Any others that popped up?
Referring to boys' opinions.
Yeah.
Studying for office / leadership roles.
Yes, absolutely.
Emphasis in sports, which ones are more attended. Power based on the performance of the person in the classroom or the athletic arena.
Absolutely. So in our society, we place value on those who can gain and maintain control over others. That's just the reality of the society that we live in. And we can see this showing up in all types of systems, whether that's politics, whether that's in school, whether that's in a workplace, right? The people who have the most control over other people end up being valued more. And then that value ultimately ends up giving them power or putting them in positions where they have power to make decisions or influence or have influence on others. And then that ultimately gives them power. So it's like this really kind of toxic cycle that we end up kind of working within. And when we talk about power and control, we are talking about control over others, right? Other people who are submissive to another person, whether that's informally, like in a maybe like a classroom dynamic, but also formally within like maybe a structured like workplace where a CEO is having control over others, but also control over the self. So again, really having value being placed on somebody who is always in control of their emotions, maybe even like physically more capable of controlling others because of their physicality, that sort of thing. So we also see this very much connected to gender roles, specifically around, again, that binary of males are supposed to have more power, be more controlling, be that leadership person, and then females being kind of relegated to the submissive role. And again, when our society is set up like that, it's not a surprise that most violence against women happens by men, right? It's just when that's how our society is structured and places value on people, that shouldn't be surprising. The other thing is most violence against men is also committed by men. So again, it's like really just identifying how we kind of normalize these things and the value that we intentionally or unintentionally place on people who exhibit this power and control that we're kind of taught to value. That also tends to play into the social norm around violence. And this has come up a little bit already, but I'm curious, what are some of the ways that we see violence being normalized in society? This may again be in a classroom or school setting, but also as a larger society.
Okay, we have video games and movies, certainly.
Definitely.
Social media,
Interesting. Yeah.
porn,
Yep.
gun
Absolutely.
culture,
What's
ma-
that? Allison?
gun culture,
Oh, okay.
mass shootings, football,
Yes.
boxing.
Yes. Yeah. And these are examples even of like violence not just being normalized, but being like entertainment, right? Like that's something that brings people some sort of joy or euphoria or like excitement to watch or to be a part of. And that even goes kind of a bit beyond normalizing, right? But kind of idolizing. Yes. So again, we have this kind of general tolerance around aggression. And again, sometimes it's even to the point where it's encouraged. We see that a lot in sports, right? There's this real kind of idolization of certain sports and certain particularly that end up being quite a bit more violent than others. And that's accepted as the norm. That's accepted as the normal behavior. So in this way, people learn that violence is a way to solve problems or to get what you want. So again, we see this in a lot of different ways, particularly again connected to gender roles when we're thinking about boys and this gender binary that we tend to put people within. But that's not to say that gender-based violence itself is the norm, right? We know that most people aren't going to abuse other people, but the normalization of violence in our society ends up desensitizing people to violence. And that can make it easier for somebody to make a choice to abuse another person, but that can also make it more tolerable for people who are on the outside, maybe looking in at that situation and saying like, well, was it really that bad? Was this really abuse? Like, I don't really think they did it intentionally, or something like that. Like, so again, this kind of normalization and desensitization around violence ends up just making it more likely that violence will happen and that it'll be generally tolerated. Oh.
Okay, so our final big social norm that we're going to talk about is just the norm of privacy and silence. So first, again in the chat, what are some subjects, and not school subjects, what are topics or areas that as a society we tend to view as shameful or too embarrassing? What comes to mind when you think of like, what are the subjects that we think of as our kind of taboo to talk about in our society? Mental health, sex, drug abuse, mental health. Yes. Cross-gender behavior, sex. Okay. Absolutely. Addiction. True, which is related to mental health, right? Body image. Yes. Racism. True. Struggling more than perceived most others are. Yeah. Abortion and miscarriage. Yes. Okay. These are all great. So for kind of the ease of talking about, I'm going to kind of say that a lot of those are under mental health, sexuality in general, and then relationship abuse, which someone said in the very beginning actually of this chat about that we tend to not talk about that when we see it coming up. These are all great examples. So if we tend to view all of those subjects as shameful to talk about or too embarrassing, that then can lead to kind of dangerous inaction and silence. So what maybe starts off as like a healthy respect for other people's privacy, that can kind of then tend to go too far to then just silence and inaction, which then becomes a real deterrent to seek help. Because if we're viewing all of these things that we just said as too embarrassing to talk about, unfortunately, what studies have shown is then there's a real connection to that to suicide and self-harm. That's because if you're a kid and you're seeing that mental health, sexuality, or being in an abusive relationship is just too embarrassing to talk about, maybe adults are even going to be too embarrassed to talk about it. It feels like there's no other option. And so, unfortunately, then things like suicide or self harm might feel like the only way to get some relief. So, what we then really want to think about is how do we let youth know that these are not too shameful to talk about, they're not too embarrassing. And what we really want to think about is bystander intervention, which is really taking on a personal responsibility and taking action to intervene when we see things that are not okay or that perpetuating these dangerous social norms. So bystander intervention occurs when a person sees a situation and voices an opinion about someone else's language and or behavior that is inappropriate, hurtful, abusive, or dangerous. And so as we get into kind of what do we do, what are some takeaways of how to change these things, we're going to think more and more about bystander interventions.
Right. And we only have 5 minutes, Jen, so I'm actually going to skip this. Is that okay? Cool. So we're going to switch gears into how we change or address these social norms.
So one of the first things that we can do to really challenge harmful norms is just be really intentional, inclusive in our language, right? So one of the first things we did was shared our pronouns. That's a great way of just allowing that conversation. Again, we don't want to be assuming that we know anyone's gender identity. And so if you are able to model sharing your pronouns, that allows other people to then say, oh, okay, then I can share what mine are. So that's just one small example of using really inclusive language and being very intentional about what kind of language we use.
Yeah, also just around language in general, like becoming more comfortable or familiar with using gender inclusive like catch-all phrases has been a really helpful thing for me. Like instead of saying, hey, you guys, right, which again may seem innocuous, but somebody in that group might not feel comfortable with that term, is say like, hey, y'all, or like, you know, how's everybody doing today? Like just using a different word, one different word might make the difference for somebody in that group. Next, calling out jokes, actions, or behaviors that reinforce harmful norms. So again, I think this is twofold in taking a moment to do some self-reflection. If there are things that you might notice around, say in your classroom, there's a disruptive female student and you automatically like go into that kind of punitive or like, why is she acting out like this? Maybe taking a moment to reflect on like, okay, why do I think that this is an inappropriate behavior for a female identified student, whereas if a male was doing that, I might see it as like normal. So taking a moment for some self-reflection around that. But also, again, a lot of times people are using language or doing things that unintentionally reinforce those norms. So whether it's like roughhousing in the hallway or, you know, yeah, maybe aggressively flirting to the point where we're not sure if it's crossing a line around sexual harassment, really being able to call that out and kind of challenge, right, that harmful norm that we're seeing kind of play out in our day-to-day. Next, not being afraid to ask or share your concerns. I think this one is so important. If you're concerned about somebody, ask them about it, talk to them about it. And you don't have to get really like in their business, like, what's going on with your relationship, right? But even just saying like, hey, I saw this thing happen in the hallway, like, how are you feeling about it? Or just opening up that conversation, also being like proactive about talking about these things. So not just waiting for an incident to happen, but proactively bringing up the conversations around healthy relationships, healthy friendships, what to do if somebody is struggling with their mental health, those sorts of things, and proactively opening up those conversations can really help to kind of get beyond that privacy and that silence, because you're just opening it up.
Yeah, and part of that, again, really breaking that norm of kind of dangerous privacy and silence is just encouraging students by modeling yourself how to be an active bystander. And so we know, of course, that teachers and staff are pulled in so many different directions. So sometimes it might be a kind of choose your battles kind of thing, and you hear an offensive joke made in the background, and it doesn't feel like it's that important to really call attention to that. But what you are doing in those moments is, first of all, modeling this of how to call out things like that. But you're also letting that one student perhaps in the group who was affected by that, you're letting them know that you care, that you see them, that that's not okay, which can make all of the difference. Because on the opposite side, when they see that no one draws attention to that, what the message is being sent then is that no one cares. No one's seeing me for who I am. No one's calling out this offensive joke. And so it actually really, really does go a long way. And again, it teaches students then how they can be active bystanders, because we know, of course, those things are going on even more when adults aren't around. And so just modeling how to call out that type of harmful behavior when it's happening. So we know that you all are, of course, very busy and have to go very soon. So just want to end with a quick quote and then share our contact information if you do have any questions or want to talk to us about anything else. But just to leave you with this, that change happens when enough people start to follow the new pattern of behavior. It replaces the old norm, or at least coexists, and weakens the enforcement mechanism associated with the older norm. So in other words, new norms emerge when enough people have made individual choices to change that a tipping point is reached. So Tracy, do you want to share our contact information really quick?
Yes, and I was just going to say, I'm going to pop a quick link in the chat to do a really brief evaluations, like 3 questions, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to do that for us.
Yeah, so here's our contact information. Like we said, if you have any more any questions, things you want to chat with us about, please feel free to reach out. And like I said, we can hang around for a little bit here if anyone also just has time to ask us any questions.
All right.
Everyone for your awesome participation in the chat. It's so appreciated.
This is so early. So thank you all for being participants at this early hour. All righty.